In this tutorial, I'm going to introduce you to the concept of callable. Callable is a similar construct to runnable, but then it solves a certain problem of runnable. It overcomes a certain limitation of runnable, and I want to demonstrate that. So let's say I create a main method, and there's going to be an area where we're going to test callable, right? So let's say I create a new runnable here. You know that with runnable, I can either create a lambda or I can create a nested inner class. So let's say I do a nested inner class approach, and just do a sysout of printed from runnable. Okay, so this is my runnable that I've created over here. We know that runnable is just any other object instance, and it doesn't really have any concurrency property of its own. What we need to do is pass it to a thread and start the thread, right? Or pass it to an executor service and have that executed. And that's what makes this run on a different thread. So you can do that. You can have this run on a different thread. But there is a certain limitation to runnable. And the limitation is that the method that runs in a separate thread is always this method, right? It's a public void run. Now, this works great when you have a one-way task. We looked at how runnable has a one-way task model. You give it a task, and then it's going to go and execute it. There's nothing that returns back to whoever's initiated it, right? So if I were to start this task, it's going to go ahead and run it, and I don't have like a loop where it gives me back a value. So let's say I want to calculate something in a separate thread and have the calculated result come back to this thread. Well, I don't have the ability to do that, right? It just goes off and does its thing, because the return is a void. There's nothing that this thing returns. So to solve this problem, there is another construct called callable. All right, so callable is a generic type. There's also an interface. And what this does is it is something that can actually go ahead and run in a separate thread, but then it can also return a value. Then you use callable, because you obviously cannot use runnable. Runnable is one way. So with a callable, you basically say, what is the thing that you want to return, right? That's what's the generic type. Let's say I want to have a callable that returns a string. So what I do is I create a callable of string, okay? And I import this from Java util concurrent callable. Now I can create a callable here, and then it works kind of like the same way. I can create a new callable of string. The only difference is that it's a generic type here, right? So that's the only thing you see as different. But then what you get when you implement a callable instance is you have a method called call instead of the method called run that you see with runnable. Okay, what does this return? This returns a string. Why is this a string? Because you defined a callable of type string, right? Where you're creating an instance of callable of type string. So the call method returns a string. So here, what you can do is return a value. Okay, so what you're doing here is you are running this in a different thread, just like you do with runnable. But unlike runnable, this one is not a void return. You can actually return a value, okay? And now I can also have this out here and say printed from callable, okay? Now, what you can do is, just like you can pass a runnable to an executor service, you can also pass a callable to an executor service, okay? You can pass a runnable to a thread, but you cannot pass a callable to a thread. If I were to say new thread and then pass in the callable, it's not going to work, okay? This is not going to work. It says it expects a runnable. I can pass a runnable, but then we know what the limitations of that are. In order to have your callable executed as a separate thread, you have to use the newer API, which is the executor service API. So I'm going to create that executor service. And the way I do it is by using executors.new fixed thread pool, and I'm going to give it a thread pool of 1, because all we need is to run this one callable. And now in the executor service, if I were to do a .execute, then I would be able to run only the runnable. Okay, I cannot use the callable even here, because the execute is similar to doing a new thread, right? So what I want to do when you are having the executor service run a callable is to use this submit method. There is another method called submit, and this one can take both a callable and a runnable. Okay, so I can say runnable of R submit of R, which basically runs a runnable. That's going to work fine. Or I can say submit of C, which is basically passing a callable, and this is going to work fine too. Okay, so I can run this thing, and what this is going to do is it's going to execute the call method of the callable, which is over here. Okay, it's going to execute that, and it is going to print this thing. Okay, so this is pretty much doing the same thing as what the runnable did, but now this callable also returns a value. Okay, so it's returning this value. Now how do I access that in this thread? I want to execute this callable, and then I want to take the return value. Can I do something like this? Can I say string return equals executor.submit? I cannot do this, because if I were to do this, this basically becomes a blocking operation, right? I'm basically waiting for this to complete, but I don't want it to wait. The whole point is to have this run in a separate thread and then kind of pick it up when you're done. I want to execute more stuff over here below this line and not have it stuck over here itself. If I'm doing this, I might as well do a c.call, right? c.call is basically what I would do, but I don't want to do this. I want to have this run by using the executor service, have it submit, saying it to say, hey, executor service, when you run this callable, I know you are going to run this call method in a different thread. When you do it, this call method is going to return a string. Can you please give me that string? Okay. How do you have the executor service return you that string? Well, the way to do this is by using an object called a future.